when he gets
Yep.
here, because I know we have a lot of people and a lot to get through. I'm calling the meeting to order. Okay. Items to be removed from the consent agenda. If a board member wishes to remove an item on the consent agenda for further discussion, a motion to remove item from consent agenda must be made. However, once a motion and second are made for the consent agenda items listed below, simple questions can be asked regarding any of them, as you would normally for individual resolutions. Consent agenda A, approval of minutes from the 7/30/20 board meeting and the 8/14/20 special board meeting. B, approval of personnel agenda. C, authorization to declare certain items obsolete or relocated. D, approval of budget transfers. Can I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved, Paul.
Second?
Second, Gladys.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, resolutions. A, resolution to award the transportation contract. Whereas based upon review and evaluation, I'm just going to read the now therefore be it resolved that the Board of Education hereby awards the 2020-2021 Home to School 2021, Summer School 2020-21, Athletic Trip and 2020-21 Field Trip Transportation contracts to First Student, Inc. Be it further resolved that the Board of Education authorizes the board president to execute the necessary documents to effectuate, said contract awards. Can I have a motion?
So moved, Paul.
Second, Ariana.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. B, adoption of the revised 2020-2021 school calendar. Recommended action that the Board of Education adopts the revised 2020-2021 school calendar as listed on the attached. Can I have a moment? Can I have a motion to approve?
So moved, Ariana.
Second,
Paul, second.
all in favor?
Would you like me to just provide some clarification?
Yeah, I do, but let me just get all in favor and then we'll go back.
Okay.
Actually, you know what? Provide the clarification
That's
now.
what I thought. So thank you. As you can see by the revised calendar, I have made the recommendation to designate September 8th, Tuesday, September 8th, which is the day after the Labor Day holiday, as the third professional development superintendent's conference day, which is full day professional development day for teachers and staff and a no school day for students. That day was originally in the calendar on the election day, which in November. We anticipate, based on our schedule, to use November 3rd, which is election day, as a remote learning day for students. That is obviously the national election, and we do not want to have students in school. That will be a professional planning day for teachers as well. In addition to now having 3 superintendent's conference days to start the school year, because they already have been established for Wednesday, September 2nd and Thursday, September 3rd, we're having what I would call is a purposeful transition back to school on the 9th, 10th, and 11th of September. We are using the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 8th as part of the tech distribution plan. We were announcing that our middle school and high school students who need a Chromebook and/or Wi-Fi will receive them on those days. We are similarly using the 9th and 10th to distribute Chromebooks, and we're talking now in the magnitude of anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 devices on the 9th and 10th for elementary students. And notice we'll go out to parents about all the process to secure a device, go through the login, and so on and so forth. The September 9th and 10th will also serve as remote learning orientation days. We have a host series of asynchronous what I would say, learning activities for students and some for parents to help students orient to the remote component of our hybrid plan. And certainly we have a number of students who've chosen the full remote option as well. Teachers will be instructed by the evening of the 10th to post assignments and Google Classroom assignments for the 11th. The 11th will be a transition back to school day. It will serve as an orientation day for kindergarten, 6th graders and 9th graders for in-person visits to schools. We will have an orientation, I believe, for the 10th graders as well. At the high school, they're going to flip-flop both in-person and asynchronous experiences for advisory and going through the abbreviated schedules at the middle school and high school as well. Our specials and at the elementary level will post welcome messages. The day will be primarily an orientation day for secondary level students to go through their schedules to get an overview of their courses in preparation for full return on the 14th.
Bob, will
So I'm sorry?
what roughly will the teachers be doing? I know that they're going to be doing some
So
prep.
there's a host of obviously professional trainings going on, as well as health and safety. So as you know, teachers have not been back into rooms since March. So one part of the adjustment in the first part of superintendent conference days is having our faculties come into the building, become really familiar, setting up their classrooms, which look vastly different than how they left their classrooms. We will spend considerable time going over logistics, health and safety protocols to ensure that our staff feel comfortable. That in addition to that, we are focusing on technology tools, as well as a range of what I would say math literacy tools for remote learning and so on. So at all levels, I would say this is going to be a significant change for our secondary level teachers who are going to be introduced to webcams and really trying to focus on. So part of the time on the 8th is going to allow teachers to actually serve both as students and teachers using webcams. So they get the perspectives on multiple fronts in terms of how their instruction will flow. We're working on ensuring consistency around Zoom, using Zoom in a very productive way as far as the remote learning, the advisory. Our specialists are working on. We're introducing Flipgrid, which is a software tool for flipped classrooms. So there's a host of activities for teachers as well.
Okay, Bob, I had if you can clarify, so the 9, 10, and 11 is orientation, but it's not like a mandate. The official day will be the 14th.
So students will have asynchronous, and parents as well, orientation activities assigned to them on the 9th and 10th. Students and parents need to go through the AUP, the revised AUP for technology. Our students at secondary level will go through a Google Applied Skills program where they're going to have to learn and actually complete tasks relative to use of Google Suite. We have a number of what I would say activities for students in those 2 days. The 11th is the day of transition back for kindergarten, 6th grade, and 9th and 10th graders. And all secondary level students, and I believe all students will be introduced, will ask to go online, log into their Google Classroom accounts. There'll be messages from teachers and an overview of coursework and modified schedules on the 11th for high school and middle school students. We also plan to launch the advisory at the secondary level. So the advisory program for 9th and 10th graders and middle school students will begin on the 11th as well. And that will be a synchronous experience. More information will follow by the principals to individual students as well as parents.
Okay. Any additional questions on the modification to the school calendar?
But so I'm sorry, I had another question about that.
Sure.
So on those days, the kids, they need to report to class. So even
No, well, on the 9th and 10th, we're working remotely on technology activities. So it will be a remote day. They will not be in school. The first day.
Even those they're gonna do that remote learning that they need to report to class. So it's not like so that's not gonna be the official day those days.
They are official days, yes. They are considered instructional days. They are our remote learning component orientation. So they do count as days, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any additional questions? Can I now have a motion to approve the modification to the school calendar?
So moved.
Second?
Yeah.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Resolution to accept an off-cycle grant award from the Mamaroneck Schools Foundation. I should have read this one earlier. Recommended action that the Board of Education accepts an off-cycle grant award of $27,227 for the 2020-2021 school year from the Mamaroneck Schools Foundation for teleassessment tools in remote and on-site environments. Can I have a motion?
So moved.
So moved. Oh, second, Paul.
Oh, what,
All in
Ariana?
favor?
Paul, would you
Aye.
like Nora I was going to ask her, Dr. Mazzoni, just to talk about the grant itself?
Yes, I was going to get to that. Thank you
Awesome.
thank you for keeping this on track, Bob. Nora, can you talk about this grant briefly?
Sure. I'd be happy to. First of all, thank you, Mamaroneck Schools Foundation. This
Absolutely.
is just an amazing grant. So I think you all know, you've heard us talking about the fact that the federal laws regarding our testing of students with disabilities under IDEA have not been lifted at all due to school closure. So we're rapidly trying to adjust to operating on two platforms to meet our obligations to kids. So we'll be testing and evaluating on-site, as well as able to do tele-assessment with kids that are at home because of medical needs or because of remote learning needs. This will enable us to not only catch up, but most importantly, learn new skills that are essential for us to master moving forward. It provides over 40 digital assessments to special educators, speech and language therapists, psychologists, and will enable us to just broaden our whole assessment toolbox in really, really exciting ways. So thank you again, Mamaroneck Schools Foundation.
Yes, and I just want to second your thanks. I mean, Mamaroneck Schools Foundation has really collectively rolled up their sleeves and asked where they can help the district. And it is very much appreciated, both this tool and their swift action and their always being ready to help in whatever way they can. So thank you very, very much.
And Rena, if I could just add, there's no other school system in Westchester that's employing this kind of tool now. So it really will put us in a very innovative place. So I'm appreciative.
Thank you. Okay, reports, discussions. Bob, we're going to turn it over to
Yeah,
you.
I would like to start off with just an update to the board and the community about interscholastic sports. Governor Cuomo recently announced, much to our surprise, that low-risk sports, interscholastic sports, school programs were eligible to begin practice, I should say, the week of the 21st. Those sports identified by the governor as low risk: soccer, field hockey, tennis, swimming, and cross country. Clearly stated that high-risk sports of football and cheerleading, they could not get the green light to go ahead for games, but they could begin practice as well, with a decision that might come between now and December in terms of competition. We were informed that the state organization, New York State Organization of Interscholastic Association, was going to release guidance documents because the governor's statement was quite broad in his comments, would provide guidelines or more details about a myriad of what I would say protocols and understandings of what would be allowed. I would say that initially the state organization made a recommendation that if any of the sports in the fall were somewhat shelved or postponed, that it would be their recommendation to move to the second option, which was to have a modified 3-sport season begin in January through May. So we were surprised to hear a silence from the state association because that was their first recommendation. It's been 72 hours. They have not provided us with any form of guidelines at this point. So we certainly are in a holding pattern. I would say that in a poll with Section 1 and Lower Hudson superintendents, overwhelmingly the majority of superintendents are seeking to delay the start of the interscholastic sports until January and go with the modified 3-season schedule. So there's a lot to be ironed out over the next couple of days or so, just on the question of what would this look like if it's going to move forward and when. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thanks, Bob. And I also want to add that I know a lot of you are utilizing the chat feature to ask questions, and we're going to hold all the questions until the end of the presentation. So thank you. And thank you, Paul, for manning that for us.
So that's just an update. Obviously, the other update is really on our plans and preparations for the start of school. I was pleased today to welcome a cohort of new teachers, and I thank you, Rena, for participating, as well as our district administrative team and building administrators. Congratulations to Annie and to Jeremy for co-facilitating a productive day for our group of new teachers. Clearly, this was not a conventional welcome and orientation, but I believe that in the end, the full day of virtual orientation was quite productive and certainly influential relative to welcoming and helping a new group of teachers become acclimated with the school system as well. And that will continue over the course of 2 more days for our new teachers as well. Meanwhile, we are making preparations for the start of school, working on, again, we anticipate, and this is kind of the approach of building the plane and flying it at the same time. I received notice earlier today that the Department of Health and New York State Department of Education are going to come up with revised health guidelines and protocols that we'll have to revise in terms of screening and just rules and regulations. So we anticipate to update our documents that are on the website. They are clarifying some issues around social distancing, transportation, so on and so forth. So much of the information we receive continues to change, is revised, and we are just in many ways reacting to that in a proactive way, providing communication where appropriate and getting ready for school. So earlier in the week, our administrators at the building level, we met to organize discussions about learning pods at the elementary grades based on preference in the commitments of parents. I want to say that as much as we initially surveyed parents about their interest of the potential option to go remote, the numbers at the time were somewhere between 30 to 35% committed to the remote option if it were made available. That's down to, I'd say, less than 15%. So, in terms of our ability to plan and understanding the staffing implications, certainly we've gone building by building, grade by grade to understand what this will look like. I'm not ruling out the possibility that based on the numbers, we'll need to combine particular grade level cohorts to provide for remote learning that may be cross schools. So I will provide certainly any information where at this point it doesn't look that way, but it may be that a kindergarten or first grade or second grade learning pod is combined in order to be able to deliver that option in a 100% manner to all students and parents who ask for that option. So that is an update, I would say, on the work. I just want to commend our building administrators. I know that the parent meetings last week were well attended, and that parents asked a lot of thoughtful questions. I would say that our building administrators, our district administrative team, has been working nonstop and doing a stellar job of really thinking creatively, but also taking the time and making the effort to ensure that we can launch into a successful start of the school year in a healthy and safe way, which is critically important to all of us. So that is my report. Are we moving on now to the discussion on budget?
Yes.
Okay. So I will move us forward, and I will certainly ask my fellow administrators to support this. I want to begin by really speaking to what I would say is something that has been on the minds of superintendents across the country, and that we are still in the midst of a pandemic, and we are still, what I would say, is feeling not only the aftermath or the current effect of what this pandemic has done to our ability to.
I'm gonna interrupt for 1 second.
Sure.
Somebody just sent me a text saying that the meetings reached a maximum of 100 participants. And it's not letting anyone else in. LMC, could you check that?
It's my understanding that there is a attendee limit of 100, which we have met. The meeting is currently streaming on YouTube as well as LMC's channel, so everyone could watch it live if that is an option.
Okay. Thank you. And there's no way to expand that on this.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you.
There an email people can send questions to if they can't get on.
Board@mamkschools.org.
Okay. All right.
Yep,
I will
thank you.
continue.
Yep.
So the quote here is comes from my National Association's letter to Congress. It is speaking to the reality, what I would say, is of the combined pandemic and fiscal crisis impact on public education, and I would say education in general. We know that we are facing tough times budgetarily, which we'll talk about tonight. And certainly the economy, the national economy, the certainly regions economy has been, what I would say, certainly in dire straits relative to the impact of pandemic. But we also know that our students have been out of school, what I would say is the regular school, for several months. We know that the issues of social emotional well-being, of social interaction around the process of learning, all of this is having the impact on children, and we believe that it will continue to play into our certainly experiences as we seek to return to normalcy in some form. I think the focus in my mind is at a time when we really need to invest in more resources for schools. We're faced with economic challenges and fiscal challenges that clearly, and especially by information that came out today statewide, with near-term and long-term fiscal hardship going forward. And that's what we would like to talk about tonight relative to our plans to certainly reopen schools and start the school year and address the issues of the fiscal crisis and the budget. So in order to really talk about where we are today, I want to take us back in time. And you recall during the spring, that I put together a recommended budget prior to I would say, direct impact of the pandemic in New York State, in our region. At the time, we had made a recommendation through the initial recommended budget to exceed our tax cap, and there were a number of factors that we presented to the board and the community, in terms of our budgetary costs, our inability to grow the budget based on the tax cap formula. And so that was the plan at the time. In April, based on the full effect of the pandemic and the beginning of the economic crisis, the board asked and we put forward $1.1 million in expenditure reductions. And then after a second phase of an additional $28,000 reductions, the board adopted a budget and the community passed a budget that was under the cap at $142,609,792 in June. I think it's important to point out that in our public conversations at the time, while we were waiting for the board to adopt the budget and we were mindful of the fiscal headwinds, or at least in many respects, what we predicted would be difficult times, we adopted a go slow approach that the board, we believed in, and I remember the statement is that despite knowing that we might have to come back and revise the budget downward based on revenues or shortfalls in revenues, that we felt that if we had reduced the budget at the time, we couldn't increase the budget by law. And so a go slow approach is the way we kind of went about the work of examining our budget and preparing for our operational plan. So the next slide really speaks to what has transpired. As you know, as I mentioned, we passed the budget at 142 million. And early in June, during a board meeting, Sylvia Wallach, Assistant Superintendent for Business Operations, pointed out that we were concerned about the potential shortfall or reduction in state aid, anywhere from 10 to 50%, and a clear understanding that through closing our facilities, we would have a significant decrease in anticipated revenue in facilities use. We would have certainly a dramatic decrease based on the present state of the economy in sales tax for revenue. And we anticipated a drop off in interest income. And so we talked about the anticipation of operating a budget with $1.1 million less in revenue, which is a significant part of the revenue, non-state aid revenue. And so based on that, we had recommended to the board that since we didn't have any action on the state aid, that we recommended that the board consider recommendations of expenditure reductions that would address the shortfall in sales tax, projected shortfall in sales tax, facilities use, and interest income. And so on June 18th, we publicly discussed the following reductions. We reduced several certified staff positions totaling $1 million, $50,000 of classified staff positions. We all certainly acknowledge that based on the pandemic, it was unlikely that we were going to move forward if we started the school year and schools were to reopen. Based on the governor's decision in August, that we were going to consider field trips or field need transportation. And we reduced a large portion of our travel and conference budget. It was in those categories in terms of staffing and programs that we identified the $1.1 million in reductions. And that's where we stopped. Whereas other districts had already, prior to the budget process, cut 20% of their revenue. The board, I believe, felt strongly that this approach of taking it in multiple steps, if necessary, would be the most, I say, strategic approach to the budget. And so we did reduce the 1.1 million. Which brings us to today. As much as we spent, certainly since May, working on our thinking about how we would consider the restart or reopening of schools, we were hoping, as we were watching over the last 90 days, that we would have some relief from the federal government around potential for what in all reality we anticipated a budget shortfall in New York State. And in the last several weeks, we've received notice and certainly ominous signs from the state Office of Budget that we should anticipate reductions 20%, and our disbursements that arrived recently demonstrated through actual amounts a reduction in anticipated aid. And I believe, Sylvia, that was for the prior school year. So it's not even, they were the final disbursements for the prior school year, and they were reduced. We also received news up until it's current as I think a week ago, that the potential that we would not receive our universal pre-K grant because of challenging budget issues at the state level. So those were certainly what I would say direct signs that things were not looking good. At this point, as of late, Governor Cuomo's administration announced that there was a shortfall statewide in tax revenue, but in the budget of $14.5 billion. We now know that and have confirmed that New York State will withhold a minimum of 20% of the state aid payments to school districts in all aid categories, I believe, totaling about $325 million statewide. And how does that impact the district? As I demonstrated in the last slide, we had calculated that a 20% reduction in state aid would amount to $1.5 million less of state aid for our budget. And so I'm going to just go back if I can. So if you look at
Before you
yes.
go back, I'm really sorry. Some things are popping up in the chat. I just want to make clear to everyone that the limit was not set by the district. This is just an LMC limit on the number of people who could join. I'm asking LMC to post the link for the YouTube chat, for where people can watch it on YouTube. And I just want to reiterate, it's also on LMC TV. I want to reiterate one additional time that emails can also be sent to the board at mamkschools.org, and we will do our best to answer the questions that come in. Sorry for that, Bob.
Not a problem. So on one hand, now we are certainly, and we now confirm that we expect to have 1.5 million less in state aid. On the other side, as we began to plan for and took steps to reopen the schools and considered the additional costs that were not budgeted for this year's budget relating to COVID, I would say, expenses or operational costs, it was important to communicate to the board, and we have in several ways, that we have significant increases in operational costs that in some ways are prerequisite to operating and reopening our schools under both hybrid and remote learning models. For example, based on our interest to have a constant flow of outside air into all classrooms and areas of school buildings, we are running our airflow HVAC systems 24/7. We anticipate that's going to add to $500,000 in utilities costs that normally was not planned for in our budget. Under the, what I would say, umbrella of operational supplies, the purchase of from cleaning materials to safety, PPE and so forth, added an additional $200,000 of expenses. And that's a starting point at this point. We made a decision because of our health plan to increase from half-time to full-time health aides to support nurses in school buildings, given the fact that if we have to screen and deal with a symptomatic case during the school day, we're going to have to isolate students and go through protocols that require more staffing. Based on the spring experience in terms of tech equity and the New York State Department of Education's expectations that we provide technology for students and Wi-Fi hotspots for students who do not have the resources, we have invested at $1.6 million in a host of technology resources. This is not only purchasing devices, but software and other needs. And then based on the hybrid model, which we feel is the best, what I would say, approach to have students in school at the elementary on a daily basis, and certainly trying to get to the 50% level at the high school if possible, but looking at the half-day sessions at the secondary level, we anticipated an additional transportation expenditure of $420,000 above what our transportation costs are. So on one hand, it's important for the board and the community to understand that we anticipate less revenue from the state, and that is on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, you see that we've had to expend significant parts of our budget well beyond what we anticipated to operate the schools moving forward. We do believe that, certainly a small portion of this, these expenses were covered by the CARES Act for reimbursement, and some may be from FEMA, but we're not optimistic that we will receive reimbursements for a majority of the expenditures. Any questions from the board? Sylvia, is there anything you want to clarify about the COVID-19 operational costs?
Nothing, Bob. You did a good job. Just that they continue to be unknown because you
Right.
never know what the next thing coming is.
Thank you. And that's why and the heading is actual and projected. Some of these have already been spent. Some of them really are projected based on what we believe will happen at this point. So as we've discussed with the board in this go slow approach and looking at dealing with the reality of what I would say is the combined issues of lower revenue as well as additional expenditures, we met certainly to talk about recommended reductions that would address address the 20% reduction of state aid. If you combine the what I would say additional expenditures with the state aid reduction, you're looking at an order of magnitude of $2.5 to $3 million of additional, of budgetary issues. But our focus for tonight is to really say to the board that we have a responsibility to identify expenditure reductions that address or strategies that are at the 1.5 reduction of state aid. And so I want to frame our approach. Number one, our goal is to maintain and deliver quality educational programs by focusing on the classroom experience. That is program integrity and certainly our ability through our teaching staff and resources and materials, professional development to ensure quality instruction in what I call the core. So beginning with focusing on the classroom and maintaining consistency in terms of that expectation, we look through the budget through the lens of how do we maintain and deliver instruction and keep program to the extent possible. And that includes our decisions at the secondary level to offer a full breadth of courses, electives to our students and what I call our specials or unified arts programs at the middle school. So we started to consider and look at our enrollment. I would say that through the budget, we had at the time anticipated close to 117 or 18 elementary section. We have seen shifts in our elementary enrollment, not only through the neighborhood schools, but at grade levels. And so one idea is to say, could we identify what called certified positions or teaching positions based on the impact of reduced enrollment at the elementary. We then started to look at the breadth of programs that have been included or supported through the budget and said, what are the realistic, what I would say, limitations and conditions through COVID that would essentially limit or remove options for certain experiences for students in school. Field trips, for example, we do not anticipate the ability to host high school, middle school, and elementary school plays. We know that we do not expect a majority of our staff to travel or participate in in-person conferences. And so we looked at the reduction of programs based on COVID related limitations. We also asked Annie Ward to look at our district professional development budget, tried to prioritize based on the importance of ongoing sustained PD, which is our model, and to ask her to make recommendations for substantial reductions to the district PD budget. And then finally, with the uncertainty of sports and our ability, given what I would say, even limited opportunities to move forward with an athletic season, we looked at some decisions around maintaining the full breadth of sports teams. As you know, Mamaroneck, our school system, we have a vibrant sports athletic program, interscholastic sports, both modified and high school. And so clearly I met with Athletic Director Barry Suman and we looked at the athletics budget and said, given limitations and the challenges we face and the potential restrictions, in what areas around interscholastic sports could we consider recommended cuts to the Board of Education? And so that was really our framework, and that's how we approached identifying the $1.5 million expenditures. What we will talk about tonight is as follows. Based on our strategy to, one, not fill vacant positions, and to reduce elementary teaching positions based on enrollment changes, we have identified 7.5 FTEs of certified staff to eliminate from the budget. This includes reassigning a special ed, internally a special ed teacher to a different position, includes not filling some leave replacement positions and shifting sections within the secondary level, and reducing our elementary positions based on enrollment. I think we are down to about 114 elementary sections from the budgeted at 118. Similarly, we looked based on our hybrid models, our AM, PM sessions, and the assignment of students to half-day sessions in the area of special ed. We were able to identify savings in the areas of classified staff, and that's primarily our teacher aides, possibility of our maintenance and clerical staff. So that really represents what I would say is the certified staff and classified staff recommended reductions. The athletic reductions that I'm recommending this evening speak to eliminating for this year the modified sports program, the varsity JV, or I call varsity B high school teams, and the freshman teams at the high school. It also includes, obviously, in the reductions, because it's not all modified sports, the transportation for those programs, the official costs. We also are reducing the athletic trainer portion of the budget. So it's a range, our BOCES officials costs as well, I think I mentioned. So that all really adds up to the $396,000 of athletic or interscholastic cuts that we're recommending. We made some decisions in talking to our secondary level principals about the full offerings of extracurricular activities. In meeting with Ms. Klain, we are still maintaining a host of what I would call virtual extracurricular activities, that some of which continued last spring when we went to full remote. Clearly, there are certain experiences I mentioned, like the high school musical, the middle school musical, and others that really are not conducive to the conditions we face this year around health and safety and social distancing. So I want to point out that we reduced the extracurricular activities. I would say is probably 50% reduction based on our ability to support certain experiences, and recognize that it's unrealistic to think that students will be traveling to, let's say, for example, the Model UN, or participating in the national and state level FBLA competition, when in many respects, we do not expect students to take any out-of-state or out-of-region travel experiences. So that really had to do with the field trips and so on, and the reduction in 122,000. There still are extracurricular activities planned for at the middle school level and the high school level. I want to make that very clear. In the school programs area, we had some remaining balances for our summer programs, which really made up a portion, I would say a majority of the school program list of reductions. That is the $97,000, I believe, and I do have the detail. In addition to that, as I mentioned earlier, Amy Ward, through looking carefully at the district professional development, reduced that budget by $77,000, which is a significant reduction in our professional development. That the combined, what I would say, reductions that have been put forward here total $2.1 million. Is important to point out to the board that that reflects the concerns about the $1.5 million of reduction in state aid at the 20% at 1.5, and the offset of the additional expenditures for COVID-related costs, operational costs that we project and have already paid for in some regards. So I want to pause for a moment here because I just want to, maybe before I do that, just point out just an updated summary of how this impacts the revenue side, at least. As you can see, early on in the column under 618, I referenced the 1.1 reductions that were made on June 18th that we all agreed on to address the shortfalls in sales tax, facilities use, and interest income. And now the 1.5 that we're talking about today in reference to what we know to be a 20% reduction in state aid reimbursement or state aid, local state aid. So I want to at least stop here, I believe, unless the board would like me to continue, unless there are some immediate questions about what I've covered.
Yeah, Bob, I had a question about the teachers' aides that you recommended to reduce 10 teachers' aid. Since you explained the schedule, they're gonna be AN and PN. I understand that. I just was thinking if after Thanksgiving, we go back hybrid, the whole school, or maybe January, we go fully in person. Do we can like recover these aids because all the students are going back, or we're gonna end in the whole year missing these 10 teachers' aid?
So thank you, Gladys. Let me step back and first talk about how we've approached the hiring of aides. The district historically, based on certainly students eligible for special education who are through their IEP assigned aides, that is a mandate. And that component of hiring aides continues to change day to day. We may have a situation where we need to hire an aide, add to the aides we have for different reasons. And so throughout the course of the year, that may change. You may go up and down based on the situation. In addition to that, we've historically hired aides at the elementary levels to really manage what I would say school operations, recess, and transitions in schools and lunch and so on. And so what we typically do in a normal year is that we identify how many aides we need to operate and then set that budget. And that's changed from 160 employed aides, some of which are part-time and just a combination, down to where we are now at 134. And so I would say to you is, given the reality of this budget, and I think the total cost of our category of teacher aides is about $3 million, I believe, in salary. We have identified the number of aides we actually need to deliver hybrid learning with the AM/PM sessions. If we were to move at any point back to what I call a regular school year, we'd have to go back and look at our budget at the time and say, what does that mean in terms of additional? The delta between the regular and where we are now wouldn't be that dramatic in terms of the 10 or 13 that we are looking to reduce. In many respects, some of them may be additional part-time people and so on. It will definitely have an impact, but at the same time, to have X number of additional aides working when we have at the school levels enough assigned to operate, it doesn't necessarily make sense. So I would say the bigger answer is if we were to see things change and be able to return to school overall, we would have to step back and make decisions about what that transition would look like in terms of all categories of staff, clearly, and where we are in the budget.
Thank you, Bob.
From a personnel perspective, can you speak to, if you were to cut, let's say, a literacy coach or a librarian, there's a lot of questions about sort of what does that look like?
Sure.
Is that sort of, can you do that on it sort of independently, or is there a hierarchy that needs to occur?
Right. So number one, we with all our instructional coaches, and certainly we have instructional coaches at the elementary and at the secondary level. We also have what I would call AAS providers and specialists, things like that. We anticipate, based on our staffing needs, to assign coaches to direct support for student instruction. So in this particular case, our coaches, their district-wide coaches, will have contact or assignments of of X number of students in this plan. That is a requirement based on our ability to accommodate both remote and hybrid pods and our staffing. So I think it's important to point out to the board and community that portion, those individuals have responsibilities of direct instruction with students. In addition to that, the way our seniority or certification rules work is that our elementary coaches are, in fact, elementary teacher certified. And so, even if we were to, when I say, if the board were to demand that we reduce our coaching positions, that has a domino effect in terms of seniority and certification. So the concern I have also is that under the seniority rules, in this particular case, we would have to make a decision in some ways to eliminate the dual language program, because many of our new hires that have come on board in the last several years have been to address the elementary dual language program. And so based on to your question, Ariana, any change in staffing has a direct impact on other programs, because all of those teachers are considered elementary teachers, and therefore it really impacts the last in terms of seniority. In this particular case, I believe it would be 2 or 3 dual language teachers, which means we wouldn't be able to have staffing to operate our dual language program, which would mean then telling parents that has to change. So that's one example. And similarly with librarian positions, many of our middle school positions also are under the elementary certification because you can go K-6. And so even changes in both of the middle school and the high school, if you were to take a secondary level a middle school science teacher, it may eliminate an AP physics teacher at the high school based on how certification works and seniority works. So all of these things are related. It's not as clear as to say we'll eliminate this and eliminate that. And it's important to point out to the board. In this particular case, I want to say that the coaches will have direct responsibilities for instruction for students, as well as our AIS maths teachers and other specialists, as well as the issue of what does it mean when we reduce force. Annie, I don't know if you want to clarify in any way, or Jeremy?
Sure. No, I think you did a good job of that, Bob. In other words, as we are right now across at the elementary level, the elementary administrators are working to really take the data from the final commitment survey, which interestingly looks very different than the data from the initial interest survey in terms of remote learning. And I did see some questions in the chat about that, about the percentages. So I don't have those at my fingertips, but I'm sure we can be very transparent. Essentially, broad brush, the difference in the pattern was that when we did the initial interest survey about remote learning back in whenever that was, early or mid-August, we had very high rates of interest. When we then followed up and administered a follow-up commitment survey, the rates dropped off fairly dramatically. It varied a little bit school by school, but I would say that it's fair to say there was less interest. So having committed to offering the remote pods, it then becomes a math exercise of figuring out how to take our existing elementary staffing and deploy that both for the hybrid in-person pods and the remote pods. And so I think what Bob is getting at is that in trying to make that work and honor the commitment that we've made, we definitely see at this point anyway, a need to redeploy some of our both professional development providers, coaches, et cetera, but also academic intervention service providers. So this is an active conversation that's having right now that we have the final numbers of how do we staff these positions appropriately. I think the second piece of that was if we were to decide that professional development, and you would not hear this from me per se, but if we were to decide in challenging budget times that we needed to reduce the number of, let's say, instructional coaches or academic intervention providers at the elementary level, where the impact of those cuts would actually be felt is at the bottom of the elementary seniority roster. I think that's what Bob was just explaining. And so we're looking carefully at those seniority rosters as we go through this process in order to figure out, we're making a cut here, but where is the impact in fact going to be felt? And so one example would be that we've been able, through wonderful recruiting by Judy Ravina, our Director of Dual Language and ENL, working with Dr. Barker and along with Dr. Oliva and Ms. Zadrima at MAS, we've recruited some very key bilingual educators who are recent hires in order to staff the Spanish zone of dual language. So even if there was an interest in reducing some of the coaching positions, where that impact might be felt is elsewhere based on seniority. So I think what Bob is saying is that we already see a need to redeploy many of our support providers and coaches in order to provide direct services and to be essentially facilitate pods in order to honor this commitment that we've now made to the community based on the strong interest to offer these pods, the remote learning option.
Just to clarify, specialists are included in that same system as well, right? They're considered like PE librarians. I'm just
well, art, music, and PE and library. Those would be when we speak of specialists at the elementary level, Ariana. That's who we're referring to. And right now, at the elementary level, the model is that the in-person component of the hybrid model involves the classroom teacher in the classroom with a pod of somewhere between 9 and 13, let's say, students. So that's going to be for half the day. That's the in-person half of the day in the hybrid model. The other half of the day, the remote half for those of the kids that are in the hybrid, is going to be specials, art, music, PE, and library, delivered in a combination of ways, delivered asynchronously in the manner that people experienced this spring. Only based on parent feedback, we've made it a priority to assign art, music, PE, and library to provide lessons for their own home schools only. That was strong feedback that we got from the parent survey, that, and understandably so, kids want to see their own familiar specialist. In addition to that, though, and also based on the learning experience of the spring, we are scheduling synchronous or live contact for every pod in every grade level at every elementary school with art, music, PE, library over the course of the 2-week cycle. So we've beefed up the component of what the specialists are offering. And that's why we're not looking to make, I mean, we value those programs immensely and are not looking to make reductions there, but particularly because the remote aspect, both for kids that are in hybrid and the all remote option, depend on having those specialists in place for those robust interactions.
Annie, I just want to clarify, because I just want to be sure that I understood Ariana's question. When you're talking about specialists, and Ariana, jump in if I'm getting this wrong, was your question as to whether that also impacted which teachers would have to, that they're considered on teaching lines? The librarians.
Oh, okay, I understand. Right. So no, that happens by, we could say, specials area, and Jeremy can really chime in here. But for example, art is a tenure area. Physical education is a tenure area. Library is a tenure area. So if we make a reduction in any one of those areas, then the same seniority rules apply, that the least senior person, the so-called last in, first out dictum, applies there.
Within those areas. So reductions in those areas would not impact, for example, the Dos Caminos example that you were.
Correct. That's right. So one of the things that's important to understand, and thanks, Rena, for the opportunity to clarify, is that when we say the elementary tenure area is very broad, and it includes teachers that are what we would call, classroom teachers, our beloved classroom teachers, but also includes the majority of the staff developers. So literacy coach, math coach, these are people assigned in those positions who are certified as elementary classroom teachers. So if we were to cut, for example, a literacy coach, the person in that role, based on seniority, would be assigned to a classroom level position. And where the impact of any cut in the elementary seniority area, where the impact of that would be felt is actually for the most recent hire. I think that's what Bob was trying to illustrate with an example, that we have recently hired bilingual teachers for our dual language program who are among the least senior, and therefore the cuts in any potential cuts to elementary teachers in that area would potentially affect those new hires who are highly valued, as all of our faculty are valued, but there would be an unintended impact on Dos Caminos if we were to reduce elementary classroom positions. I think that's essentially what Bob was getting at.
Bob, do you know if other districts, neighboring districts, Harrison, Scarsdale, are they looking at similar options in terms of sports? Do you have any idea?
My response, I have to say, right now, first of all, Scarsdale does not have modified sports. There are only a few districts that actually have modified sports philosophy. Because there is a strong recreational presence in town of Scarsdale, that they offer that, plus the range similar to Mamaroneck, the travel teams and so on and so forth, and youth sports. Most, if not all, districts in our area have put on hold all athletics. As I mentioned at the beginning of our meeting, there's questions by all superintendents in our region whether it is safe to move forward with athletics. I would say the majority, and I agree, believe that we should wait until use the January 1st option. Our concern right now is, can we safely reopen schools and make sure that we maintain safety over certainly through the fall? And the idea of adding sports, we would not open locker rooms, the additional triple the cost of transportation just to run some sports. Is it fair not to run a range of sports? All of this has arguably encouraged superintendents to say, let's take a wait and see attitude and hold off. So it may be that the state organization recommends, as they suggested, that we move all sports programs into the January, which would then condense and limit our ability to manage sports in our facilities, also as well. At this point, there are no state championships. There are no sectional championships. There's talk of the possibility of having, through the limited sports program, just contests with local, when I say local, Rye, Harrison, Mamaroneck, many of the student schools that are not in our league, and limit to just having the season modified to play the same teams over contests. There's a lot of talk about delaying the sports program and offering conditioning and really preparing students who have not participated in athletics for some time the opportunity to get in shape and condition. So one is the step into it approach the state is talking about, where we would have 2 or 3 times a week opportunities to offer conditioning and training to get students ready and prepared for the rigors of interscholastic sports. And then, to be honest with you, Ariana, we're dealing with the issue, what happens if a student on a team tests positive? Do you shut down right away the sports schedule because you have to quarantine and no one's practicing and so on and so forth? It's very complicated. So any additional questions from the board?
Bob, I just had a quick question regarding when you're talking about cutting of teachers. Can you talk a little bit about the responsibility of the district in terms of unemployment and how that works? I think that's an important point that we should discuss, and how it's different than other unemployment benefits in private companies.
Yes. And first of all, it could be a lead in. We put into the budget each year a set amount of money for all categories of employees around unemployment. And obviously, we've been adding positions the last decade significantly in terms of based on the enrollment changes. And so I think as of last year, we created additional 50 teaching positions in the district. But I will ask Sylvia to kind of talk about the dollar for dollar reimbursement, because we also have $100,000 in unemployment reserve, knowing that at difficult times, we may have to pay out significant amounts of unemployment. And that's what I guess I'm alluding to. So Sylvia, would you like to just give a thorough answer to that question?
Sure, I'm going to try between barking because there's a storm going on here. But with school districts, unlike private industry, we pay for unemployment costs directly. So every time someone claims unemployment against the district, we're actually making that payment to them. It's going through the state, but we're reimbursing the state for those payments. As you know, we kind of knew this was coming and set up a reserve for unemployment for $100,000, but that will really only represent 5 employees.
Is there a model to be able to have sort of the cuts occur if we weren't traveling for sports, but we are still practicing? Is that a model in terms of some reductions there so that teams were still meeting?
Well, we anticipate there's going to be additional reductions in the athletic budget based on the fact that, number one, we feel that even if the limited number of sports play, the schedule itself is not going to be a full schedule. And so monies that are set for transportation for a full season would not be used. That said, we really, did not intend, or I do not recommend that we eliminate athletics at the varsity level specifically, only because there is probably a more likely scenario that they'll move the seasons to a modified schedule beginning in the wintertime through the rest of the season. So we will certainly want to hold off on that at this time. I mean, when you look at our costs for athletics, there are essentially 3 main areas. There's the coaching stipends. There's certainly transportation, which is significant. And if in the case here now, that if we were going to have transportation, we would probably have to double or triple the bus transportation costs just to go to athletic contests because of the social distancing requirements on buses. When you think then it's also the officials' costs that come into, I'd say, the 3 main buckets of sports teams' expenditures. I don't believe, for example, they're going to approve cheerleading at all this year or wrestling. There's questions about whether basketball will be allowed. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty around interscholastic sports, and certainly we were surprised by the governor's declaration last week.
Okay, any additional questions from the board at this point before we go on to the next slide?
So the board, we thought you might have questions about where we stand in terms of reserves. I asked Sylvia to organize and take a few moments to talk through where we stand with our reserve funds. As Sylvia just mentioned, we are allowed under state law to reserve for unanticipated or future unemployment insurance. And so that's what was referenced in the unemployment reserve. But Sylvia, would you like to just provide the board with an update on reserves?
Sure. So these are unaudited numbers. We're expecting the audit report within a few weeks, but it shows the result of operations, the revenues fairly close to budget, the expenditures significantly lower than budget for the 1920 year because of the reduction in transportation, utilities, substitute costs, and costs we didn't incur as a result of closing. We end the year in better financial shape than the year before, but still only at about 11% fund balance compared to our budget. We have the reserve for tax certiorari, which is used to pay claims against the district. There's another slide on that, so I'll show you. We set up a reserve for self-insured health insurance. So we joined MEBCO this year, but at the end of the year, there will be a reconciliation. Sorry. The reserve for encumbrances, those are just purchases that were made prior to the end of the year, but they didn't come in. So those monies are not everything that's in there has probably already been paid for. The reserve for workers' compensation is a reserve for the claims received for injuries incurred prior to joining the Southern Westchester Consortium in July of 2018. We still have a large claim outstanding that has yet to be settled. With the reserve for unemployment insurance we talked about, the budget in the 2021 budget, we appropriated $400,000 of fund balance, and then the reserve for TRS is used to pay for unexpected increases in the rates. And we can be fairly certain that the rates are going to go up significantly as a result of this financial crisis. The unassigned fund balance is under 4%. The district is allowed to have a 4% fund balance according to the state.
Okay.
The tax certiorari claims that were outstanding at June 30th, they're significantly higher now because we're getting the new ones in for this year, but at June 30th is 42.8 million. We project that those will settle at 35% at about 15 million. And as you saw on the prior page, the reserve for tax certiorari we have is 6.5 million, leaving us an unfunded liability of 8.5 million.
Which would be payable when, Sylvia?
It's payable as the claims get settled. So the town settles them. We have very little control over, we have no control over when they are settled. We do have representation at the table for certain claims, but the town is really the organization that controls these settlements.
So this unfunded liability that we'd have, it's not something that's going to be payable all at once. It's something that's going to be payable.
Right. We pay out, anywhere from $1 million to several $1 million per year. And you are required to have a reserve for each year that you're refunding. So if we're refunding a tax, let's say for the 17-18 school year, we are required to take it from that pot of 17-18 money.
Understood. Could you go back, unless anybody has questions on this particular slide, if we could just go back one? Thank you. So before I jump in, does anybody else have a question on the reserves? I have a couple of questions. So I know that we're going out with a bond, and that our borrowing rates are based on our bond rating. If the board decide, if we in these discussions we decide that it would be a good idea to draw down on some of the reserves, what would the impact be on our borrowing?
So if you recall the Moody's report that came out when we did the refunding a few months ago, gave us a AA rating and stated that, if the reserves, if we were to continue to use reserves, it could lower our rating. So if we were to go from a AA to an A, it's about 25 basis points. It is about, I think, 125, cost us on the $50 million bond, about $2 million over the life of the bond, which would be about 15 years. So it's just one reason to not, reduce reserves. Another reason is, 10%, 11% of the budget is not a lot of safety net for a $140 million budget and over 1 million square feet of facilities where anything could happen at any time.
Okay. Now they base their bond rating on how much sitting in our fund balance, because our fund balance has gone up.
Right. Right. So they base their rating on the fact that we told them that our fund balance would go up at June 30th. They did this much earlier in the year, and we explained that it was our expectation that our fund balance would increase, and that was part of why, and we gave them reasons for it, and that was part of why they did the AA rating and didn't do it lower. And they said that in their report.
Okay. What did we project our borrowing costs would be?
So when we were doing the work in 2018, we were using much higher interest rates. We were using interest rates about 3%. When we did the budget for 2021, we had much more current information and used 1.5%, a little less than about 1.5%. In August, the rates, the obligation rates, and these are, from capital markets advisors, and they're general, they're not specifically ours. For the 15-year bond, the AA rating was at 1.17, and the A rating was at 1.42. So the 25 basis points, or 0.25%, equals about $125,000 a year, or $2 million over the life of the loan.
Okay. Additional question on the tax cert. If we were to pull some money for the tax cert, could you just talk about what options we have to fund shortfalls, i.e. a bond anticipation note?
Sure.
And what those rates are and what the additional cost would be?
Right. So the Cuomo has put out a ruling where usually you can't touch reserves for anything other than what the funds are reserved for. But they did put out a ruling saying that we can borrow from the reserves, and we have to pay it back over a 5-year period, interest bearing. So that is something that is allowed. The bond anticipation notes, it's a whole long thing, but the borrowing costs are set in our budget, and they really should not change because our tax cap was based upon them. And I can certainly answer more about that.
So that the other option is that we could borrow from our tax cert, pay it back as outlined in the legislation signed by Governor Cuomo, and pay it back with the interest that the money would have earned had it remained in the reserve. Is that correct?
We could do that. I mean, taking out any significant portion of the $6 million reserve, we could pay out very easily $3 million this year in tax certs. I'm not saying that we will or we won't, but it's not outside of the realm of possibility of what this district has paid in recent past years.
Thank you.
So I guess, Sylvia, the question related to the part you spoke about before. So the impact on our bond rating, if we were to borrow more money from the reserves, how long what kind of an impact are we talking about? How long would that impact our bond rating? I guess that is the question.
It would impact it, for the term until we could turn things around. The problem is it's going to impact it right when we're going to borrow for capital projects.
Okay.
We're talking about a difference of 1.42 versus 1.5, which is what you projected in the 2021 budget. Is that correct?
That's the budget to what actual would be, but if we stayed at a AA, it would be 1.17.
1.17, sorry.
For August, like these are going to change tomorrow, right, in September, but that's what it is right now.
1.17.
The differential is 25 basis points.
Right.
25 basis points, right? Okay.
I have more than a question, it's like a reflection for the board and for the administration. We are facing the crisis, calling the crisis of the century. Something the last time that happened was 1918. And this is not just happening in Mamaroneck, it's happening in the world. And I think that these reserves that we have, if we're not using something at this moment of the crisis, so when? Maybe waiting another 100 years for a crisis. I know how important can be the AA rating for the district, but I also know how important is CAD programs like the sports, they're affecting the life of the kids. They are coming to our district right now. So I just invite to reflect. This is really a major, major crisis in history. And it's going to affect the kids not only now, but a little bit in the future. So I think this is the moment that we need to be thinking out the box, doing the extraordinary, go the extra mile, do things that we never had done, maybe towards the reserves, like what we can do to continue to provide the quality of the education and the well-being of the kids that come into our district. So it just
So I just want to respond, and I appreciate that. And certainly it's the board's purview. I think what Sylvia is trying to look at is the broad near-term and long-term picture. One of the concerns we have from the administrator's perspective is that, faced with a similar state fiscal crisis and national economic crisis, it took 4 or 5 years for even the state to come back and be able to get to what I would say pre-existing levels of funding, not get to the funding levels that should be with inflation or additional cost. So a big concern in our view is that there are so many related impacts to all of this. The last time we had economic downturn, we had an impact on our total assessment. And so when we had our budgets, any change in the assessed valuation would have a direct impact on taxes to support our budgets. We were paying out a higher number of tax surcharges. And so it's not as simple as to say, let's understand the moment, and I appreciate that. In terms of the staff reductions, right now, you're talking about 1.5, 1.8 of staff reductions. The modified sports program is, I think, about $208,000 to run all those programs. The other thing you have to understand is I'm not even saying if things were not directly, if we were looking at hardship around the budget, that we would deliver an athletic program that is our athletic program. There are a number of health and safety restrictions and potential additional costs that really would make it almost impractical or impossible to say we're going to have a regular year of interscholastic sports. So, I mean, there's one thing to say is let's just hold off and wait and see. There's another to say how we're dealing with the magnitude of the revenue shortfall. We can't go over our budget. And we're not sure with our COVID-related operational expenditures what the future may hold relative to additional costs. So all I'm saying to you is that we want to look just beyond the ability to say, how do we make ourselves whole in this budget, and understand that we haven't even started the school year yet. And we've already been notified a lot of these clear reductions in revenue that it's going to be significant. That's all. I just want to just say that I granted, Gladys, I appreciate, and I'm not advocating, we built a budget based on what we expect school to be and how we operate our program, and now we're making adjustments. Again, at the high school, it's not that we're not going to have the school newspaper and certain other programs. Many of these can be done through a virtual or remote environment, but we're not going to go up to Rochester to participate in FBLA. It's just not going to happen. We're not going to have a robotics tournament, outside the state. There are certain things we know that will be certainly eliminated from the experience based on the fact that we're dealing with a pandemic, and our ability just to operate school will be challenging this year. So I don't want to lose sight of the reality overall.
Yeah. Oh, but thank you for your answer. And I just wanted to give a little bit context to my question. I mentioned sports just to give an example, but I'm so concerned every single card is there. I know that perhaps it's necessary. And it's just a reflection that I put over there and for us to figure out what we can do. And
Right.
think.
And I listen, I would say this, one of the things I've noticed over obviously the last 3 months is the number of youth sports that and the traveling teams that have participated through the youth sports program. Certainly Athletic Director Barry Simon and I talked about the possibility of working with the towns to have an intramural or rec program that could come out of the cancellation, if possible, in working in partnership. So certainly there are options here that don't reflect the full sports program that may not even be realistic if it was not a budgetary issue at this point.
I agree with Gladys about it, if not now, when, in terms of just looking at potential use of reserves and wonder whether it's makes sense to perhaps not fill the whole gap, but is there some part that could be filled? And I'm going to talk about it out of both sides of my mouth, because I also recognize that looking at this as a one-year Band-Aid probably doesn't make sense either, because likely, 21, 22, we're going to have the same sort of issues in terms of the revenue. And as you said, going further out. I also think it would be helpful, and there are a bunch of comments in the chat about trying to be more specific about what sports programs are included and which ones aren't, as well as the extracurriculars. And to your point, there are a whole bunch that just won't happen because they can't happen. And then there are ones that are, could happen and will depend on budget, which I think feeds into this discussion about, is there some reserve that could help fill a gap to try and make this year, as positive for everyone as we can, given the circumstances.
Yeah, to piggyback off of what Rob just said, I agree. That I think is exactly sort of the crux of what everyone's getting at. Is like, is there some reserve money that could take us through fall? Because I think as we look at winter, while we're hopeful that life returns to normal, I think we understand that as things move inside, that may be less of a possibility. So I think if we can truncate the year into pieces, knowing that fall may sort of be our best shot at some normalcy, and sort of think about reserves in terms of the fall, and then sort of take each chapter as it comes, understanding that we're in a pandemic. And obviously, again, we're not looking to erode reserves entirely, but how do we sort of pick the things that are safe right now in this outdoor environment, understanding sort of the full whole child picture?
As I said, at this point, there have been no reductions to the high school athletic program, short of the second varsity soccer team and the freshman baseball team, which is a spring sport. But there's been no clearance of football. There's been no clearance for cheerleading. And, even the question is, what will the sports season look like in a reduced version? And the expenditures that are, the part of the problem with athletics, we don't even know the rules of the road, because the state has not given us guidance of what can and cannot happen relative to how a sport would operate. Excuse me. We're looking at additional $420,000 of additional transportation costs just to focus in on our hybrid learning model. I can't portend what the additional athletic transportation costs will be if we have to, triple the amount of transportation just to get a team down the road. So there's a lot of unknowns here that I can't speak to relative to what we're talking about. The recommended cuts right now in athletics refer to the modified sports program, which are not slated to start on time and wouldn't start in probably most likely until October. The high school sports start eligible for the 21st of September. So, we're looking at a truncated program there, if at best. And then again, we don't know what other districts may certainly do relative to even keeping that program alive. So we could have a modified sports program and find out that several of the districts we are on our schedule aren't playing modified sports. So in this particular area, I think there's so many unknown questions relative to what it will or will not be relative to the regulations and health and safety. That's the other part of it. So that's one of it. I mean, if you wanted to at least revisit here and talking about reductions, on the personnel side, we're talking about teaching positions that have not been filled relative to the reductions. The elementary positions, clearly, every year in August, I say to the board, here's our elementary enrollment based on grade level sections. Here's what we budgeted for, and that's it. Reassigning a special ed teacher, again, is to fill a position that's open and it's just an internal move that will provide savings. The aide positions we talked about, right now we've hired the aides we need to run through the year as we start the year. And so we know that that's savings. We've reduced our custodial overtime only because we know we will not be opening our buildings after 3 o'clock. Based on the fact that our primary goal and aim is to have our AM and PM sessions, clean the buildings, and prepare for the next day. And so that will limit the instances other than deep cleaning or other circumstances that may come up in emergencies for overtime. And so a lot of the personnel cuts in our minds are pretty clear relative to those reductions and addressing the state aid reductions. When you talk about additional cuts to professional development, when you talk about the clubs and activities, again, even the clubs and activities, if we didn't make the cuts, I would say that we would not move forward with many of these experiences as I've described based on health and safety and the fact that these clubs are in-person events that require travel, in some cases out of state, and those, they're just not being organized and occurring, based on what's happening with the pandemic. We don't anticipate field trips this year. We're not going to spend money on transportation for field trips because we're not sending students to Sharp. We're not, going to the Maritime Museum and so on and so forth. So we've identified discrete reductions that address the reality of our fiscal state in most parts, short of the modified sports, that are sensible relative to our fiscal straits. That's all. And the unknowns. I mean, I can go back to, and I don't necessarily have to, but, we didn't anticipate the significant amount of additional expenditures based on prerequisites for opening relative to COVID. And that's something I hope our community understands, that we are, certainly our priority to open school is the health and safety of children and staff. And so a lot of the operational supplies, the HVAC systems, the technology, the health aides, they're all related to the conditions that we're facing to operate our schools and have some form of regular program.
And I just want to go back and say none of us want to make any of these cuts. I mean, we had proposed a budget originally, going back to that first slide, and you don't have to go back to it, Bob, that had a lot more money in our budget than originally was passed by the community. So none of these things are things that I think the board, and I'll speak for the board, and certainly the administration, wants to do. We're in this position right now because the federal funding that the state was hoping we would receive, we have not received. And that's the reason we're currently in the position that we're in. So, I appreciate that you're trying to make the best of a very, very bad situation and, preserve as many jobs as possible. And, listen, none of this is good, none of it. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. I do want to leave time. I know we have a lot of questions sitting in the chat room, and I want to get to those. So unless the board has a burning question right now, I'd like to move to the questions that Paul has been accumulating in the chat. Is everybody good with that?
Yes, we should get to the questions.
Okay, let's get to the questions. Paul, do you want to read the questions?
Hey, Paul, you're on
Oh,
mute.
you're on mute, Paul. Okay.
Sorry. Yep. First couple questions were regarding percentage of parents who requested full remote. I think Annie had mentioned that she don't think she had that exact number, but
I did. I'm sorry, Paul. I did mention in the beginning. I think it was approximately in the survey originally. It was, obviously school by school was different, but I think it was close to 30%. And now we're at 15 or a little bit less than 15%, probably.
In the original, it was over 60%. That's
Okay.
what I was alluding to, that there was a huge swing,
Thank you.
which was part of our challenge in those who originally expressed interest in that first survey, the interest survey, to then those who actually committed. So the figure that I didn't have was the actual commitments as of our latest. We're still continuing to follow up with individual families who haven't
Right.
responded. So Bob, do you have the
We're
latest?
right around 15%. So it went from 60 to 15%.
Next couple of questions regarding why are we delaying sports starting from Chris Jogas, but that's not our decision. Is that correct, Bob? That is a state decision about delaying sports to start, correct?
Right. We just received word from Governor Cuomo, I think on last Friday, that sports could start. Some sports could start low risk.
Correct. Okay.
And they could start, in September 21st.
Right.
However, the state organization that guides state interscholastic sports has not said that, and superintendents in terms of section 1, because in each interscholastic section of the state, there's a section that guides sports and they make decisions based on their governance as well. So for example, in Nassau County, that section said no sports until January. So this is driven by various levels that determine whether sports will happen. And ultimately, you may have districts who say, we're not playing. So you may not have opponents to play if you wanted to have those sports experiences.
Right. Okay. So from Nikki Kettler, please can you explain the literacy footprint program, what grades this will be implemented into, if it is used with a science of reading phonics program, and in what capacity, hybrid or virtual? What is the cost of this, and what is the efficacy and tier system for struggling readers, and what are the peer review results from all levels of readers?
Paul, can we park that one? And I'm sorry to Nikki, the woman who asked it, but can we just prioritize the questions right now on the budget, and then we'll get to those?
Well, yeah, my only comment on that, Rena, is that literacy footprints is budget neutral. We're funding that well within our existing textbook and supply dollars. I'd be happy to respond to Nikki. I can actually share a white paper about literacy footprints. It is a program for guided reading K-5, but it's being entirely funded within our existing budget lines. And yeah, I can provide a lot more information there. Maybe I'll post the white paper in the chat right now that speaks to the research base behind it.
Okay, but Annie, you could get back to Nikki when with a longer reply than you just gave right now regarding some of her questions.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Let's see. From Lauren Roth, a $420,000 in additional transportation expenses seems high given the amount of busing in the district. Please break out the line item further.
That cost represents the cost of the midday buses, mostly for Homics, but right now we just have a morning and afternoon bus, and we'll be, instead of having 2 buses, we'll be having one pickup and 1 drop off. We'll be having 2 pickups and 2 drop offs.
Okay. There's actually a couple questions regarding fundraising for sports, for modified, I guess is the specific question. Can we talk to that, Bob? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly there's always a possibility. I would say there have been occasions over my 11 years, certainly prior to my arrival in 2009-10, where there was significant fundraising for and donations to run programs. So I certainly defer to the board. It's the board's prerogative to take donations to at least use that for fundraising for particular programs. There are some limitations legally about what you can fundraise for and what is the responsibility of the district for the program.
Okay, great. From Jennifer Vaccaro, how much revenue was left in the 1920 budget? Is there a contingency for emergencies such as this pandemic?
Well, first of all, it's the governor that today or yesterday made exceptions to the use of reserves, because there's, for designated reserves, and I'll defer to Sylvia, for most designated reserves other than fund balance, you can only use them for particular purposes. So, I think it's the governor's executive order that has changed that, if I'm correct, Sylvia.
Yes, that's correct. It's the order that will allow us to borrow from those reserves and pay them back over a period of 5 years.
Okay.
I think the question was how much fund balance, what was left at the end of the year. I mean, I think the board made a decision
So there was an increase of fund balance from last year of about $3.6 million. And that was mostly a result of the unused expenditure amounts for transportation, utilities, substitute teachers, field trips, things that we didn't use since we closed in March.
Okay. Another question from Jeannie. Was there a transportation survey sent out? I suspect people will not want to put their children on a bus. May save some money. I don't know if it.
We did talk about doing that a month or so ago, and we did poll a few people, and not a lot, maybe 20 people, because we were thinking about it. But the vast majority of people said while they may or may not use the transportation, they would not give up their right to it and give it up for the year.
And similarly, for our obligation to provide transportation for private and parochial schools, we're seeing steady use of requests for reimbursement for public transportation.
Yes, and some of those parents were included in our informal survey as well.
Okay. From Katie Fitzgerald, last year, Homix added an additional assistant principal and a director of student life. Do we really need those considering kids are not in school full time?
The assistant principal, I would say that what we recommended to the board around the AP position is that the school has grown in its enrollment from less than 1,000 to close to 1,300, and it was a decision to certainly the AP position has incredible amount of supervisory responsibilities in terms of teacher evaluation and just the management of the school. I think that's critical. The director of student life position, April Francis just recently announced that she's leaving the district to take on a regional equity leadership position, something that she's been interested in, and we certainly wish her the best of luck. It's our interest to continue to use that position to focus in on the advisory, the launch of the student advisory at Homix, and a continuation of a number of the initiatives, first-year initiatives on school climate for school. The Department of Education, the Board of Regents, has made it clear that focusing on social emotional well-being and the programs for students in the school is a priority, given the pandemic, the loss of social interactions in schools. And so we have what I would say a significant investment in responsibility to focus on guidance programs, social emotional well-being, and the director of student life is a part of that mix as well.
Okay. So let's see.
If I can, before I just, Paul, I saw a question coming up about performing arts programs. As you know, part of what is in the list of cuts are the high school musical and the middle school musical and plays. We do not anticipate the ability to deliver on those in-person productions unless things change significantly. As it stands now, we're limited in number of students who can even come into our schools and occupy a space. And I found it interesting that with indoor sports in the governor's request, it's only 50% participation in that. And there's a cap on how many individuals can be indoors even in one place at one time. And so many of these things are just not likely, musical concerts and things like that.
But
Unless
Bob,
we do
just to
virtually.
follow up on the performing arts question, you know, the cuts to the performing arts at this point, we're not proposing that those cuts be made permanent. This is just, you know, for this.
Correct. This is just to, given the conditions and the restrictions of that. And similarly with the athletics, I'm just saying, one, with the budget situation, and two, the realistic ability to manage a full athletic program. So that's just where we are today.
Can you clarify exactly what level of sports will be eliminated? So I think
There's
been a couple of those questions. So
answered
it's 7th and 8th grade teams.
Yep,
It's
yep.
the varsity B. I believe we have a varsity B soccer program because of the number of students who are interested, and 9th grade a baseball team that has been on and off for several years. So that 9th grade baseball team in past years has been eliminated. It was brought back, but we're talking about modified, which I believe includes soccer, includes field hockey, it includes volleyball. I believe it's lacrosse, and basketball. So it's a limited number of sports. Track.
Okay. Let's see. Did you look at eliminating non-teaching positions for services that can't be delivered during the pandemic, library clerk / aides at multiple schools, for example?
And those are included in the contract.
Yeah, I think we talked about that. Okay. Let's see. Similar question there. What are from Jennifer Vicar again? What are the extracurricular activities? I guess that you mentioned at the middle school level. I guess she's asking about those that are cut at the middle school level, and I don't think we know that answer correct.
I don't know the specifics. We allocated a certain amount of money for middle school activities. It's really Dr. Saki and PT. I mean, it's really driven by student interest. There's a host of activities similar to the high school. We're not eliminating all extracurricular activities. We've eliminated a number of them based on what is required to run them. The in-person experience versus the virtual experience. And so that really was a lot of our defining criteria for what stayed. Model Congress at the high school, for example, regional science research, National Honor Society, Multicultural Club, these things can be run virtually. And so they are a priority of this claim. Caprice Advisor, even FBLA, we know there's a portion of that could be virtual and remote. So we didn't eliminate these. It's just modifying or making decisions on where we want to put the opportunities for students.
Okay. From Chris Jogas again, why are we funding a summer camp in the budget for $270K? Should that be picked up by the town?
Right.
It's referring to the co-op camp, I'm sure.
The co-op camp, which is the summer enrichment program, in the budget reductions, we did take the remaining dollars for the co-op camp program, and that's part of the cuts, as well as the remaining balance for summer school that was not used. So we did actually use that, incorporate that as part of the list of cuts.
Okay. From Katie Fitzgerald, are we cutting pre-K?
No. We are waiting, at this point, as I mentioned in the beginning, the UPK grant, which is $313,000, we did not receive approval for that, up until last week. So that there was a lot of concerns, and they did tell us directly, do not expect the full reimbursement. So at a minimum, we will see a reduction in 20%. There was a question, I believe, about the bus, the transport students. I believe that bus has been eliminated.
Bob, can I just add, yes, the bus has been eliminated, that's for certain. But I just want to make clear that that pre-K program is not funded from our general fund budget. That is a specific grant from the government that we get. And as you said, we have been told to expect a 20% cut, and we have conveyed that message to the people that run the program, and they are reducing their program accordingly.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Sylvia. So from Ann Good, can you expand upon the increased COVID-related transportation costs? How much of that is Homix busing, which could theoretically be provided via public transport?
Can I answer that?
Sure.
Yes.
So we are required to provide transportation for K through 8 students that live 2 miles or more than 2 miles from the school. So we cannot, while we offer the high school students public transportation because that requirement is 3 miles, we cannot offer the K through 8 students. As a matter of board policy and regulation, it's the high school students that are offered the public transportation passes, not the K through 8 students. And again, we are required to provide K through 8 students that live more than 2 miles from the school transportation to and from school.
And historically, we've tried to, even for our other students, had worked with Beeline to increase the number of routes. In this particular case, I think they're actually reducing routes, we were told.
Okay. Let's see. So you are cutting sports to pay Dos Caminos teachers. Does that program help more students?
No,
I mean, that's
not accurate. What the question came up in terms of seniority and what the impact would be. First of all, we have well over 300 to 400 Dos Caminos students who are in the program K7. Second of all, there's no relationship between cutting sports and Dos Caminos. The question came up is if we were to cut additional teachers, how does that reduction in force impact a program like Dos Caminos that have teachers who were recently hired to provide for that program? And that was the comment. There is no connection between the dual language program and athletics.
Right.
I have a question going back to athletics. So there are schools, and this showed up in the chat also, there are schools such as New Rochelle and Portchester who we do play, who now have announced that they're going full remote through the month of September. How does that impact us with regard to athletics?
So the New York State Athletic Association announced last week that school districts who go to full remote, that the students who participate in interscholastic would not be ineligible to participate. So they anticipated that. What's interesting though is that many districts who went to full remote, for a number of decisions, including budgets, have wondering how they're going to get kids back into school who are certainly eligible for busing so that they can participate in athletics. Hence, just another issue of cost and challenges as well. But the state association did not make remote learners ineligible for sports. And so that would be true to our students as well who were interested in playing. I would have to say though, in the case where we have parents who voluntarily chose remote learning because of concerns in health and safety, are now saying that they'd like their kids to play sports. Our concern is the risk of health and safety because of sports. So I just put that out there as a question I have is what would change?
Okay. So from Tiffany Smith, maybe we should take a bigger look at the construction that was supposed to start this summer. We have a new normal for school. Maybe we use that money that was allocated for the construction and we look at it, but that's a bond that has nothing to do with the budget. So, right. Okay. Let's see, let's keep on going here. There are several questions about administrative salaries. All that information is available in the budget book. So it's all available publicly. Let's see, if students will be, this is from Harper Kaplan. If students will be leaving school to have lunch at home, won't there be considerable savings and cafeteria reductions?
Want me to answer?
Sure.
So our school lunch program and breakfast program is run by Aramark. We don't support it. The general fund budget does not support the food service budget in any way. It's a separate fund. It's accounted for separately. And Aramark also provides the food. So it's their employees that will be coming in or not coming in, not ours.
Okay. Let's see. So we clarified that. Okay. Please clarify literacy coach. Does that include resource room literacy specialists? It does not? Okay.
No, Annie,
Resource room would fall under student support services, mandated services provided through students' IEPs. So no.
and that category is called, we identify those as reading specialists. That is.
Well, so there's a couple of categories here. Again, if we want to talk about tenure areas. So there are special educators who provide IEP mandated services, and those fall under the special education tenure and seniority area. There are literacy specialists, many of whom are what we would call AIS reading teachers who provide academic intervention services. And then there are literacy coach, or I saw another question above about literacy ambassador. Those are literacy specialists, but who fall under the elementary teacher certification area. So the answer to Nikki's question there is no. A resource room literacy specialist would likely be in a different category under special education.
Okay. Let's see. How will remote learning improve this year? Specific. Oh, that we'll go back to that. We'll go back to that. Yep, that's fine. Yep.
I just want to go back, Bob, in terms of timing for when these decisions need to be made. So the governor announced that the date for the start of sports, if they were to start at all, would be September 21st. Is that correct?
I believe so. I think practice can start before that. Clearance, they've reduced the number of practices that students will be eligible to participate in an actual contest. But Athletic Director Barry Simon would have to notify that. Right now, we have no guidance documents on, both at the section level, the state level, of how do you take the governor's pronouncement, and then what does that mean in terms of how we actually organize and operate interscholastic sports. And that's what we were promised today, by the end of the day, that has not been published.
Which is not a surprise.
That's for low risk sports. When I say that, the governor's determination.
That's just the way things have been going. I want to go back to something that you mentioned about modified sports at the Homics. You had mentioned something about Barry reaching out to see if there was some sort of a program.
Right. So the idea was also, there are a couple ideas. One, we talked about talking to the town, and certainly in the areas of volleyball, where the town has, possibility to do it on Harbor Island, some intramural type program for volleyball, and some other opportunities that they could, maybe field hockey and stuff like that, where we can do something as an intramural, as a way to provide opportunities. I know that a majority of our students play in traveling teams for soccer, I believe, that's in the fall, these under whatever age levels and so on. But the idea here was to get creative where possible, to think about what we could offer in partnership, or intramurals doing something as a fraction of the cost of what these programs would be.
And when will we have the information as to whether that would be a possibility? Because
it's something that Barry would have to pursue to see if it's even feasible or possible. But when you asked me about the modified sports, just so I have the details, there's cross country, there's field hockey, football, which is offline now. There's boys and girls soccer, there's volleyball, basketball, ice hockey, wrestling, baseball, lacrosse, softball. So obviously you have spring sports and winter sports included as well. Right now, ice hockey is not permitted from the governor. That's considered a high-risk sport, as well as volleyball, wrestling.
I'm going to circle back, Paul. That question, I think you were asking about literacy. I think it was dovetailing off of something I had asked earlier. So I just want to follow up. I think that with that, I don't know who asked it, was trying to clarify is they were trying to differentiate between the student-facing literacy people, right? Someone who requires remediation, right? Versus an ambassador position. And I guess the question that Annie, I think we had started to get at earlier too, was those people who are sort of, doing book matching and some of that stuff that's more less obvious student interfacing? What does that look like in a remote environment, and how do their roles morph to sort of be student facing?
Sure. Well, the book matching has been student facing during the pandemic. Our literacy AIS teachers and our librarians have each had substantial caseloads during the quarantine. Sylvia can attest. So the business office has been a wonderful partner to us in helping us transfer resources from one area to support really equipping kids with both electronic texts and striving readers with both electronic texts as well as hard copy texts, in some cases mailed to their homes. So I would say that we made the best effort possible to transfer our robust array of in-person services to remote through the spring. I think the additional comment I'd make is that based on the challenge, as I was saying before, of staffing both the in-person hybrid pods as well as the sort of elective full remote pods, we do anticipate having to assign a number of our academic intervention service providers, both in literacy and math, as well as our staff developers, math coach, literacy coach, et cetera, to these remote learning pods in order to make the numbers work.
Okay. A couple of questions regarding. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to say, and first of all, forgive me. I've had a very hard time getting on tonight, so I'm just getting into the tail end of this. But I think as we move into this season, I think the initial reaction from all of our constituents is, what can we hold on to? What can we keep intact? And I think Bob has been working overtime to make sure that he's shielding the instruction piece as best as possible. I just wanted to encourage everyone on the call to keep in mind that some of us have a lot more than others. And when we talk about what it is that we value, just keep in mind that when we support the most vulnerable of students, it raises the value of our district in so many ways. So some of us are a lot more blessed than others. And yes, we're all willing to take the hit, but let us also be willing to get in there and see what we can do to support those that are truly in trouble. As our district is making these cuts, there are families right now that are struggling to maintain their home, their apartment. And let's also keep in mind that let's try to do our best to keep them in our hearts and as we go forward in thinking about cuts and things of this nature. And Bob, I just want to say thank you again for what you're doing for keeping our instructional piece intact as best as possible. But what can we do outside of that to support these families that are struggling as well? So when I hear ideas of partnering with community leagues and getting kids outdoors as well and making those partnerships, that's important. Keeping these clubs virtual as best as possible and keeping students engaged that might need it more than others as well. So again, just thank you for the work that you're doing, and let's also keep these things in mind as we proceed forward.
Thank you, Christian. So Sylvia, there was a couple questions regarding the large claim outstanding. You had mentioned that. Can you?
Sorry, I was just talking about the tax cert claims, Paul.
The tax certs, right? Okay. There was a mention of okay, that's right. It was a tax certiorari, nothing to do with any type of legal issues. Okay, just making sure.
No, the tax cert claims are large refunds that are
for tax purposes. Correct.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I want to advance us forward just a little bit, Paul, and then we can get back to some of the other, if there's some remaining questions, and some of them that we're not able to answer tonight. We can certainly get back to you with answers as best we can to some of those. Bob, given some of the work that you're trying to do with Barry in figuring out opportunities for children at the middle school to be able to get out there and play or practice, is it best that we look at this in stages and talk about this for modified sports at this point as just being something for the fall, crafting some sort of a program there, and then looking at the winter and spring separately? I guess my question is, do we need to sort of press the pause button and see what we could creatively, together with the community, as Christian pointed out, come up with to give these kids an opportunity to have some recreational time outdoors?
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to suggest, number one, there's still a lot of questions on uncertainty of whether the programs will in some ways be deferred to January. When I say just the high school, nobody is even talking yet about modified. They're just trying to figure out what will happen with high school sports. The second possibility is that districts will not move forward with modified sports, those that actually have modified sports programs, because there are not a whole lot of districts in our surrounding area that have those programs as well. And so there are question marks that need to be in some ways answered relative just interscholastic sports, not even when we're talking about modified. The second thing is that there is a consensus by superintendents, and Barry and I have talked about what a limited sports program would look like, that we wait to focus in on reopening our schools, that we get through the month of September and early October to see if we can operate safely in a way that is our priority. Certainly, I can say I am all in favor of activity and outdoor, sports that can be done safely and within reason. The real other question mark is, do we have the capacity to operate all these teams when we have restrictions as well? So, we don't anticipate, even on a limited sport basis, opening up locker rooms. And so just logistically, how do we deal with things? So I guess going slow makes sense, Rena, if that is what's the board's interested relative to the cuts to modified. Obviously the personnel cuts have a direct impact, because in some cases we have to hire people or inform them that there are no positions for them in certain areas where we've made decisions to reduce in force. Many of our, as I said, certified positions are not filled, so this is not someone losing their position. So you could look at this in stages relative to, what I would say, personnel cuts, program cuts, and other areas of reductions. Based on what we know today.
Right. I think from my perspective, we've adopted a go slow approach all the way. And there are some people that we really do need to notify at this point. And I think that for individuals that, or positions that we know we're not going to fill, or that we do not need because of the way education is going to be delivered, i.e. hybrid and remote, then those are decisions that we can and need to make right now, because it's time to make those decisions. Those numbers are not going to change. So I would say that we should go ahead with those right now. As for the other ones, if we can hold off and it doesn't put us in a precarious position regarding our finances, I would think that we should have a go slow approach and see what we could come up with in terms of creative solutions at the modified sports level, and see what's happening in surrounding districts. I don't know how everybody else feels about that, or Bob, how you feel about that, but I just want to put that out there as a means of moving us forward a bit.
I agree. And I was wondering if we could, I don't know if this is possible enough, we could earmark some tax cert money, and not use it if it doesn't end up needing to be used, or as sort of a placeholder. And or I know it was brought up if the community could fundraise. I know that there are question marks about that, but is there some way to have some placeholder for fall sports that could still potentially run right now? And then if they don't take that money, obviously, and reallocate it back.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Rena and Ariana. We've taken a go slow approach, and I think it's served us well earlier this year regarding the budget. So I don't know why, if to Rena's point, if it's not going to be put us in a financial hardship, I don't know why we wouldn't think about taking this approach with the modified sports
So
you know,
I just
a
want
little
to
slower.
clarify, we did say clearly the $1.5 million was something that we certainly had to agree to and understand the impact of that certainty, and we've already seen that. The other thing I'll just say, I mean, because the total range of reductions that we've put forward, I believe, is $2.1 million. You know, the other reductions around field trips, certain categories, it's all, in my mind, certain that we would not move forward. You know, it seems to me that there are some things we can agree to relative to the need to manage this budget. And what Sylvia has said to us all along is the reality of that we have additional expenditures that are significantly higher than what we have budgeted for. So I just want to, you know, balance out the conversation. I mean, certainly when you look at the personnel cuts that we've identified, maintaining and protecting the core instruction and experience and being able to manage the hybrid and/or possibility remote is what's there. You know, we also have to think in terms of scenarios. Many districts have already committed to remote learning. There's a possibility that 2-3 months from now, we may be in a full remote setting. That will change the nature of our budget as well. So that's where the go slow approach kind of comes into play. So I'm not, again, all I'm saying is that there are real shortfalls that we need to address. There are things that we need to answer that will play out in the next several weeks relative to guidance and clarity. And we'll understand that. And we'll actually know much more. We'll know that based on how we have to transport athletes, that transportation may quadruple and that may prohibit our ability and so on and so forth. Or other school districts will limit their schedule and the number of teams. So this is what we know today. And we want to be sensitive of our responsibility to address budgetary issues with you and the board and make sound decisions at this point.
So what you're saying is that we need to cut 1.4, that $1.5 million needs to be cut now.
I would make a recommendation now, the 1.5, but above that, based on what I would say, the issues that are pretty straightforward, unless the board feels otherwise. You know, as I said, there are categories that we, you know, presented in terms of extracurricular activities and other programs that, you know, we've put forward.
Rob,
So
did you have a question? Okay.
I have to admit, Bob, I'm looking.
Sorry.
Go ahead,
Sorry,
Bob.
Paul. Maybe just a suggestion that I think we talked about before, Bob, of just like a specific list of the things that you know based on today would need to get cut because they can't happen, and the things that we're going to go slow and see how things unfold. Right, the ones that logically it just can't happen because whatever's been canceled, and the other things that we can adopt a more go slow attitude and how those numbers shake out.
Well, you know, as I said, in my mind, the personnel cuts are pretty straightforward at this point, right?
Yeah,
I don't see us using the summer continuing ed, the summer school dollars, the co-op, the remaining balance of the co-op. That combined together is $97,000 in program reductions.
And Bob, I'm not asking for it now. I'm just saying
Okay.
It might be helpful as a go forward item for us to see.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
I have provided the board at least with, you know, as far as that memo with the detail of the categories, but to make that public, sure. I mean, in detail, sure. You know, I wanted to clarify. I said, you know, the athletic department cuts were 320,000, not over 400,000. They include a range of reductions. You know, when it's called a cost for officials, transportation costs, they have to do with security that we set aside when we would have evening events. There are certain things that we know are given that go beyond just the modified sports program. So, you know, I just to be very clear, the modified sports program is in the 200,000 range plus transportation and so on.
Yeah, can we maybe line item that out a little so that like certain things are given, you know, there'll not be a night where everyone gathers. There'll not, you know, maybe there'll be the transportation piece we eliminate, but then we're able to run a modified program without some of those costs. So we're not looking at the totality number, we're looking at sort of a more realistic number given a pandemic.
Certainly can ask Barry to come back and revise on that. Yep.
Bob, when you're speaking about the co-op program, are you equating that to not running the co-op program?
No,
this
it has
summer?
nothing, it does not touch the planning money that is cycled through, no.
Got it. Thank you. And that is a good idea, Ariana. Let's take a look at that. And obviously, you know, people don't have to go to the games, but the kids are playing the games, and no need for security and stuff like that. Get your own way there.
Well, that goes to the question of crafting some sort of intramural program. If the goal is to keep these kids, you know, playing and on fields, that we could do something like that at a far lower cost. Okay.
A couple more questions I think that are relevant. So you mentioned talking about what is the impact in the budget if the district was forced to go into full remote, Bob? I know you probably don't have a specific number, but what would the cost associated with that look like?
I think the hard part there is to understand is that for a prolonged period of time or, you know, a shortened period of time? Clearly, we realized that, you know, in the course of the spring, that, you know, we did not have transportation costs and certain things, substitute costs. This time, our transportation contract requires us to commit X amount of dollars if, in fact, we were to cancel that because of non-use. So, you know, where in the past we were able to have significant savings, that's not something that would, you know, something that no longer would be a recognized savings. I think it's very hard to predict that, but I do know that there would be for full remote over the course of a prolonged period of time savings.
Okay, Bob, what's a proposal at this point? Because we do need to make some decisions, and there's
certainly if we go back to the presentation, you know, in terms of what we've presented here, I would say that there are $2.1 million worth of reductions that we shared with the board, of which, you know, we have, I'd say, the personnel cuts that I think all told, I believe, Sylvia, are in the 1.1 range, 1.2, 1.4.
You want 1.4.
1.4.
just to be clear. So when we talked about fundraising, personnel is not something that the community can fundraise for. Correct?
For salaries?
For salaries, that's not something that could be fundraised by the community. For our staff, for the classified and certified positions.
I would have to get legal.
I thought that I thought that the answer was that we couldn't, but
I believe you're right, Rena, but we'll double check.
okay. Sorry to interrupt, Bob. Go ahead.
Sure. The athletics of the 396, as I said, that does not speak to just the modified sports program. It you know, it reduces the athletic trainer percentage, the supervision and security, transportation. I mean, there's a range of expenditures, I think, beyond just the full modified sports program. So, you know, again, that's something that really speaks to the full amount of 396,000, whereas the modified sports in its entirety, I think, is about 258,000. The clubs and field trips, the field trips is just a small portion. When I say that, well, it includes for field trips $35,000, and then the transportation component of $21,000. So it's roughly 51,000 of the 132. The remainder is 76,000 in clubs, and that's primarily at the high school. And those are things, you know, that includes the musicals, that the cost of productions of musicals, of Shakespeare. There's certain things that are excluded, as well as some of the FBLA full program, things that require travel. And then professional development is straightforward. That's district professional development. That is a reduction in Helen Pashley, the science part of our ongoing multi-year effort to revamp our science units, Science 21, and other substantial portion of our district PD budget.
Okay.
All right.
And
There's
And
one.
this is modified and where does freshman sports fall on this?
There's, I believe, in the list of cuts, there's one freshman team that there aren't a number of freshman teams. I believe we only have one freshman team. And it's possible we change with hockey each year, but we have a freshman baseball team that has been on and off again in the last 5 to 6 years. And we have a JVB or a second varsity, I believe, boys team.
Okay. All right. So if we separate out the amount allocable, I'm going to Ariana's question about separating out the amount that's allocable to say if the board decides that let's pull $100,000 out of reserves. And then I'm pausing because I'm also looking, we're not just talking about sports here. And I want to go back. I mean, these are cuts in either positions we're not filling or individuals who will be notifying are no longer needed. So this is not just about cutting athletics. These cuts carry through a lot of categories. So if we pull money from reserves, we're not saying that we would just use it for athletics.
Right.
It might be used and the administration may decide that it's best used and could be used for classrooms. Is that something also that we should consider?
Sorry, will you repeat that, Rena?
Yeah, I know. It was a pretty long-winded question that we keep on focusing just on athletics, I guess my point. And, Christian made this point earlier. This is, there are cuts that are coming out of a whole bunch of different categories. Like I said, none of these do we want to make. So if we're utilizing some money out of our reserves, my question for the administration would be, where would you want that money to be directed? What would you really want to be able to preserve that we probably can't fundraise for, i.e. staff positions that are?
Well, I can say that right now, part of our preparation is to examine the total number of learning pods and the impact of how remote learning is organized across the system. So obviously we're very tight on the teaching the elementary teacher section in terms of how we assign staff, but that's unfolding. Certainly, to me, that's obviously a priority. We've made adjustments to transferring a special ed teaching position based on priorities, but I'm certainly comfortable with that decision relative to the ability to provide that. As I said, the decisions around personnel are pretty direct relative to the reductions. I think, obviously, we're not inclined to cut professional development because we feel even the reductions to our ongoing work in science, that all of this is critical to the core of instruction. So these haven't been easy decisions, and certainly, my concern is that there may be more in the near-term future based on what happens over the next 90 days with this budget.
Related to that, and in the chat, I just see Ann Good's question, which I think is really relevant to the point you just made, which is what is the projected size of the fully remote elementary pods will they have the 9 to 14 students that the in-person classes are expected to have? Or will they be larger, closer to the 22 to 26 that would be in each class if we weren't in a COVID environment? And the answer is the former, that right now, as Bob said, we are prioritizing the quality, the teacher-student ratio in the remote learning pod, so that we're aiming for the size of the remote pods to be comparable to the size of the in-person learning pods for kids that have selected the hybrid option. So that is a substantial investment of staffing in that area, as I was mentioning earlier, that we need to acknowledge. And that's a decision and a priority that we have set, but certainly that is an area that that could be revisited because you know, the staffing is where the lion's share of our resources are currently tied up.
Bob?
Yes.
So just to be clear, with everything going on in the budget, we are already set for every child who might need a device, access to technology, to receive that, yes?
That's correct.
Okay,
As I
excellent.
mentioned earlier, I think right now we have about 1,500 requests for Chromebooks, a district issued device, and about 100 to 140 Wi-Fi hotspots.
And a parent should just reach out to their building level principal.
Well, we actually had a survey that was part of the commitment survey. So every child and every family was surveyed, and will continue to respond to those who have not responded, who are needed and eligible as well.
That was the concern. Those that didn't respond to the survey, if they hear about other people getting it, they should just reach out.
Mhm.
Excellent.
But picking up in Rena's question before, so if the staff that you're suggesting for reduction is straightforward and field trips, for instance, right there we're talking about $1.5 million reduction. Can we wait a little bit more for professional development, athletics, school programs? Perhaps to explore the idea of fundraising, or we cannot wait?
I think, I mean, certainly defer to Celia. I mean, the bottom line is, I think, as we mentioned, we really have overspent, when I say overspent, certain categories based on the COVID operational costs at a level where we're close to about $3.3 million. So, you know, the reality is that what we have identified in this presentation represents more than the 1.5 and more than the 2.1, but we were kind of looking at the additional costs could be managed through the budget process through the course of the year as we see how the budget unfolds and how the school year unfolds.
Listen, I mean, you know, all of this are, you know, all of these are choices. I mean, we could have said to parents, look, we're not giving you a remote option. The remote, because the remote option is something that costs the district more to be able to run in terms of staffing. And I guess, you know, the frustration in my voice is not with the parents asking the questions or with the district. We are in this situation because we are having 20% of our funding cut, and need to make decisions that you have said your philosophy is to preserve the classroom and educational experience for students. Now, I would say that we're risking that for all students. Well, I don't want to say we're risking that, but, you know, by cutting professional development, we want to be sure that our remote learning environment is as robust as possible. And as many have pointed out in the community, we don't want a repeat of what occurred in the spring. And I know that you have been working tirelessly all summer together with with building administrators and your administrative team to come up with plans to ensure that our students have a robust experience. So this is not just about, we're talking about $200,000 for modified athletics for something that we may be able to provide through a different means. If the goal is to try to preserve something for the kids and have them out there on fields and playing, it seems as if we could accomplish that while still making some of these cuts and separating out the costs, as Ariana said, the costs of things that we will not be able to do anyway, which are included in this $396,000 line.
One other question to dovetail on that, Rena, is I hear you, Bob. First of all, I think it's remarkable that, what the work that's gone into getting children into the building, as we see more and more districts struggle to accomplish what the plan you've created, which really feels doable and is, in process. So, but with that, I understand there's huge expenses in terms of the air filtration and sanitizing stuff. Is there room also through, Mamaroneck schools or in general, given that that's sort of a very specific to this year, hopefully limited to this year expense, to maintain cleaning, is that also something that we could be fundraising for as a community, understanding that this is really driving up our costs and taking away from things that we'd rather be using our budget toward?
I would say we certainly have been in conversations with Foundation. They are terrific, and as an example of this evening, for approving the off-cycle teleassessment grant, we've had conversations to talk about the possibility of additional support, and so that's ongoing. I certainly think the Foundation has to stay true to their mission and what they exist in terms of what they pay for and what's is approved as far as the grant process, though we appreciate and will continue that conversation. So I don't know if that's necessarily the solution, because we anticipate a lot of these operational costs to grow over the course of the year. We do obviously have to and have accounted for the daily cleaning, the staffing, and the issues to support what we feel is a safe learning environment at this point. I want to say one thing, because I think it's important to clarify, because I know it's been coming in, it's not off topic. At this point, there has been no decision to play any interscholastic sports going forward in this district. And so, whereas we're not talking about cutting any varsity sports, we're not, as of today, made any commitment to move forward with the fall sports season in any form. And we may decide, along with all area school districts, to shift that to the January 1st option. And so, whereas this conversation is that we're cutting sports, the only thing that is on the table was what we talked about in terms of the modified sports program. And again, there are a lot of specifics as to whether that program would even run if the board decided to hold off on reducing that. So I know we're spending a lot of time in athletics, but I want to be clear, I have not authorized Barry Sillman to organize practices for field hockey, for other sports at this time. And that decision may not be made for days, if not weeks at this point, based on where we stand.
Thank you, Bob. All right, I want to move this forward. I don't think we're going to advance this decision anymore. So I'd like to just get the board. I would like to ask you all how you're feeling about this in terms of how best to proceed, given the fact that we are on a very tight timeline here with respect to some of these cuts and reductions. Anybody?
I would like to go with the philosophy or go slow in some of the items now in all that was presented in the chart.
I think go ahead, Bob. I think the point that Bob, you were making, that we already are in the hole for a substantial amount of money.
$3.3 million.
Correct.
I think we also need to keep in focus, as one of our community members just said, how important it is to really keep the eye on the prize and making sure we have a rich, and to what Rena was saying, a rich and robust remote experience for our students, because come the flu season, come the winter, it might just be that we are in remote for quite a while. And we need to make sure we're ready. And I am glad that we are taking that extra time to do so. But to proceed slowly, I believe is the wise course, but also make sure that we are preparing for a possible worst case scenario here. And again, I know a lot of work has gone into the remote option, and that might be the only option.
But there is some level of cuts that we need to agree to tonight, I'm assuming. Is that what you're saying, Rena? That
Yes,
in order to notify people
yes,
that have
exactly.
been identified as not having jobs in the fall, we need to make decisions on that to be fair to them and to make sure that we're, taking responsibility for the budget and our reduced revenue. So is it possible to look at making a decision on those known pieces with a further look at the specific cuts being made to non-personnel?
And to add on that, I would also say that that $200,000 that is allocated for modified sports, we could park it to the side and see how things are developing, and then and make a decision as to all or a portion of that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that one of the things that, Bob, to your point, you've mentioned this several times. This decision could possibly be made for us. We may not have any say in what happens with modified sports.
Right.
So I guess my thought would be, if we can park it, I would be more comfortable doing that, to be honest. I would be.
So everybody, I just want to, and I know I'm going back and forth a lot. Well, I don't know about back and forth, but I also want to emphasize that we have staff that they're doing a lot more work as a result of everything that's happened with COVID and with children's needs. And, I just want to acknowledge that. I just want to, put this in perspective as to what we're talking about. I guess I'm jumping on what Christian's point was. This we have to be able to stand back as a board and look at this as look at the big picture. That's what we're charged with doing. And I know it stinks, but that's our obligation as board members, to be able to look at this from multiple perspectives, understanding that, as I said earlier, there's nothing good about it. So what I propose, what I would say that I'm comfortable with, and I don't know if the board is comfortable with this at this point, is to say that we are going to be making these cuts. We're going to be parking approximately $200,000, which we'll say is a decision that will come within the next couple of weeks with regard to modified sports. And I guess it's just one B team that you're talking about, and see what, if anything, can be developed so that kids can be able to have some time outdoors to be able to play. What's going on with the rec leagues? I've heard somewhere, I think somebody weighed in, that there's no travel soccer at all. Is that accurate, that kids are going to be playing rec soccer within the community?
They're playing, but they're not competing with outside of the community. They're playing.
Yeah, travel soccer is occurring, but it's only within Larchmont and Mamaroneck community.
Right.
They might form some scrimmages with Rye and stuff of that nature, but
I just want to clarify, Rena, though, if we park the 200,000, I want to be careful, because I really do want to maintain the integrity of the plan that's been created academically. And I don't want to then, as we're coming on, rolling out classes, et cetera, both for hybrid and remote, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that I think we've really maintained the integrity of small class size and I think there is a value in keeping kids within the building if possible. And I know that may not, that if suddenly we need to take money from somewhere else, that we may need to then blend pods, et cetera. And then there's a whole other conversation we need to be having. And so I also, if we are going to thumbnail that $200,000, I would sort of say it with the caveat that I'm not looking to then take it on the heels of the education, which I think you guys have done a remarkable job maintaining the integrity of. And so I really want it to stay there.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
That's
So-
why I just wanted to mention the question in the chat, because I did want to make it clear that right now, the budget as proposed includes the parallel size for the remote pods. And you know, that is an obvious area where by enlarging the size of the remote pods, there could be staffing reductions there. But we've chosen, as Ariana said, to prioritize both the in-person and the remote learning class size across all levels of the system. We've chosen to prioritize.
And the other thing, not to be the bearer of bad news, but this could get worse. This could get worse during this year. I mean, there is potential that at some point we could lose more money.
So can I suggest, if you look at the personnel reductions, if you look at $1.4 million, if you look at the $77,000 in professional development, if you look at the $132,000 in extracurricular activities, that includes field trip, transportation, and so on, and the co-op and the summer school residual, you're talking about $1.7 million of reductions. That does not touch the athletic, though I think there's a portion in athletics that, you know, non-modified that is realistic in terms of some of the additional costs. But I'm just trying to give you a perspective of what we're talking here in terms of categories of reductions and the need to get to, you know, the $1.5 million as a basis for the 20% state aid cut that is real. That is a minimum reduction right now. So I'm trying to help the board see in terms of these categories what we're talking about here. As Annie mentioned, and I agree, you know, we haven't talked at all about special education and the unknowns around compensatory services. There's a lot of additional expenditures and mandated costs that, you know, are going to come in front of us as well that we don't know about yet, that we need to plan for. And again, you know, we're trying to finalize and evaluate the learning pods, and there may be adjustments in personnel that we need to contend with. So I'm just putting it all out there. So there's nothing that is not transparent and visible to the board and community.
Bob, a quick question. Those classified employees that we've outlined here, they don't play a role in any way in supporting the online learning, the remote option, and making sure those students are signing in and reaching out.
Our aides, in terms that make up the bulk of that, they are about day-to-day school operations and then special ed assignments that comes up.
Okay.
You know, Bob, I'm glad you made the point about special ed and compensatory services and what we're going to see in terms of needs of the kids. And because that might result in having to pull from other lines, and we're cutting very close. And that may be a time when we need to pull some funds out of reserves and shift things around a bit. So
You're also talking about our multilingual learners, Rena.
Yeah, as much as I don't want to at this point, given what may be coming down the pike, I would say that we should make these cuts now.
Sorry, I know we're a little stuck, but the only counter to that though is the flip side is if we do end up in remote, which I hope we do not, that there is, you know, like there are also flip sides, say, you know, we don't know where this nets out in terms of like then suddenly we're not cleaning the building, you know, so that, which is what happened last year. So I don't hope it goes there, but because there are so many unknowns, we have to also, as we solve for this, you know, be transparent about the fact that there may also be savings that, on the heels of things we don't want, but savings nonetheless. Which is
And
why that goes low.
we also need to look at this in terms of how many kids are we impacting by virtue of these cuts. So, when we're talking about things such as remote learning, special education, size of the pods, our robust hybrid model, that really has significant impact on a lot of children. Now, I know if it's your child, it still hurts. But I really am concerned about the cost going forward as we move ahead. So again, board, I need you to speak up because Bob and Annie and Sylvia, we need to move ahead with what we're doing here. So Paul, do you have any thoughts?
No, listen, I understand the need to do cuts and to have cuts immediately. I get that. I really do. I really wish there was there's got to be a way we can figure out this modified situation, some sort of a way we can somehow figure this out, because even to Christian's point, this impacts, a lot of kids that need that outlet, that this is their one outlet to getting out of the house, to having the opportunity to do things. So that's important to me too. In terms of cutting what we need to cut from a FTE perspective, that needs to be done. I agree with that. I just wish there was a way. The earmark idea is interesting to me, and I would like to pursue that. But it's my thoughts. Anyone else?
So how does that translate into a proposal, I guess, of what we end up recommending? So it sounds like a recommendation to pursue the outlined personnel cuts as well as the professional development, and I'm probably going to miss a couple of line items.
Can you bring that back up, Bob?
Sure. Okay.
So the proposal would be to go forward with the certified classified staff, clubs and field trips, but with a commitment that we're going to share specifics around those things and identify things that we believe have no chance of happening given the current environment.
Yeah, that's already happened relative to at least the reality today, Rob, based on conversations with the high school principal and so on.
Yeah, no, I'm just talking about sharing that.
Right.
Just being
absolutely
trying to share a list with the community of what those things are and what we believe is not going to happen. And I guess same with school programs and professional development, and then taking a wait and see on some portion of that athletic line item as it relates to potential modified sports in the fall and spring, or fall, winter, and spring.
Right. That would be my recommendation. That gets us to, as I said, the 1.7 to 1.8 figure that I think is critical based on the shortfall. Because in the 396 athletics, it does not break down. That's not modified, all modified sports.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Rob on that. Bob, I know there was a question about co-op camp. Could you guys quickly go over how co-op camp really supported what we're moving into now, which is our hybrid and remote options?
Well, I mean, each year, the co-op camp budget is predicated on the budget passing. I mean, we contribute, I think, for up to 220 students. I think it's approximately $200,000 is the total budget. Part of that budget, it covers really two parts. It's the summer program commitment, and then it's the planning and the curriculum development for the following year. So the entire, what's in the budget document is not necessarily the cost of the summer program. It's a summer program plus the following year's planning, program development. And that portion of that's in the budget is contingent upon whether that program will continue the following summer. So,
But also speaking to the specific need it played this summer in particular.
well, this summer it was done as a virtual program, but it was really targeted to focus on preparing students to be independent for the hybrid remote learning. And there was, the program itself was a model program to focus on digital fluency and proficiency, actually giving students the capacity to prepare for what they're going to experience now in the fall. That is a combination of in-person and remote learning. I think,
Okay.
is that what you're?
I appreciate it, Bob. I just wanted the community to know the value of that program, specifically during this time. And I believe it was over 200 students that participated, yes?
Yes, close to.
Okay. I want to move back to what Rob proposed. Bob, do you want to state it once again? And
Yep.
then I think that we need to wrap up.
Rob, are you gonna, is that, you want Rob or, it's my
I don't
understanding.
care.
That's fine. It's my understanding that we move forward with both the certified and classified reductions. We would move forward with the club field trips. We're going to share with the community the specific extracurricular activities that won't take place based on the conditions that we have in front of us. We were going to eliminate the school program dollars, and which is really the residual for co-op camp and summer school. And we were going to eliminate the professional development, and then put a hold on the modified portion of the athletics reductions. That's what I thought was presented.
I agree with that.
I'm in agreement with that.
That's what I think we should move forward with tonight.
Agreed.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Rob, what were you going to say? And
Sorry,
I do want to go back. One of the things that Ariana pointed out is about that $200,000 that we're parking it, but we're going to be looking at things as they develop. So we're not saying that we're using that $200,000 and it's earmarked for modified sports. What we are saying is that $200,000 is going to be parked to the side as we get a clearer picture of the needs that we have for the students in our schools as we get closer to the second week in September. So I just want to be sure that that's clear, that this is not an earmarked amount for modified sports. We're pulling $200,000 as we get more information as to what is going to be required, what our plans are, and what our needs are.
And if I can just clarify,
I don't want people at this meeting to expect, oh, we're parking 200,000 and that's just going to be allocated for modified sports, because that's
Right.
not necessarily
right.
what.
But I just want to say one thing. I just so we of be specific here. The modified sports program in total is a little bit less than 200,000 plus transportation and officials. So it's more than 200,000. I just want to say for its entirety. But so I can provide the board with specifics, but I just want to say if you're using the earmark of 200,000, it doesn't necessarily cover the entirety of what the outlays are for a full modified sports program would require.
I think
So if it's somewhere in the vicinity of
there, Bob.
$250,000.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, we may have,
Yeah.
if we have additional costs, with PPE, and I'm not willing to commit us at this point to say that we're not going to make the cut in modified sports, because I do see the need for really having to use this money. So again, at this point, it's not something that I'm willing to say that money is being earmarked for modified sports. We have a community with a growing amount of need in many areas. It's wonderful that we can provide remote learning in smaller pods, and we can provide and have to provide, classrooms with smaller sizes, and that we are committed to having the appropriate level of staff in order to meet those needs. And you have stated very clearly that that is our top priority. So we need to keep our eyes on the ball with respect to what we're trying to accomplish in what is a very, very challenging environment where you're getting guidance at the last minute, all of which results in additional expenses. You jump through hoops to be able to see that our ESY program took place with our staff. You've developed this, you together with your building principals have worked your butts off this summer to try to understand how you can best meet the needs of all students in our classes. Student Support Services has worked tirelessly to make assessments and to be able to meet the needs of students. And in an environment where they're coming back to school, where they have not been in school for months, and we don't know what's going to happen with these kids when they return in terms of their mental health needs. And I want to be sure that we have the resources available to meet those needs. And while I understand the importance and value of being kids allowed to play on fields for modified sports, we have to make decisions here. And for me and from my perspective, that's my priority, is what I've stated before, is being able to meet the heightened needs, all kids that are coming back into our schools in the fall, and to adequately staff. So that's where I stand on it.
I'm in agreement with that as well.
Okay, I think we've addressed the issues on this topic, and we'll make the adjustments in the budget, and we'll move forward as planned.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Right.
And thanks to the community for all your questions. I know this is a frustrating meeting, and I know that you'll have a lot of other questions, but I know that we've been able to put our heads together and problem solve in the past for things that we can problem solve, keeping the needs of the kids in mind. And I have full confidence that, as painful as this is, and will continue to be, and will get worse, that as a community, we're going to be able to come together and solve this. So in that, thank you all very much.
Do we need a motion to adjourn this meeting?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Gladys. Can I have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
So moved.
So, second.
Who said first? Christine?
Oh, Rob did.
Me.
Or Rob? Oh,
Second was Paul.
Yep.
thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
We are adjourned. Thank you.